Howdy, folks, and welcome back to Volume 6 of our journey through the Book of Revelation. Today we're going to jump into Chapter 9, and before we dive in where we left off last time, maybe I should take a moment to stop and set the scene, and also consider again why I think I have an emotional attachment to this book, and why it seems to feel relevant to what we're seeing in the news or what's going on in the world right now. I think it's because this book is about endings. It's about finality. That's the overall tone. It's about a time of judgment, a time when there's no more things to do aside from reflecting on mistakes. It's the time to suffer consequences of the things that happened years ago. And we're also hearing the voice of someone from a very troubled society, where the government was trying to control the minds of citizens through compelled speech and rites you were required to perform and beliefs you were forbidden from having, friendships you were forbidden from forming. Another way to look at this time period and get a sense of the darkness and despair that someone like John might feel when he reflects on the Greco-Roman world, the world of his time. One thing to consider, to maybe put yourself in his position, is he comes from a society where almost no one does any productive work. And what I mean by that is that no one earns money from working. Rich people do nothing, and poor people work very hard all day. I think to any normal human sensibility, that world would strike them as being morally backwards. What do I mean by non-productive work? Well, whoever's working on these farms to produce all this food, surely that's productive work, right? Otherwise, people are starving. Well, what I mean by non-productive is that by this point, by the 1st century AD, when Rome had secured its grip on the Mediterranean basin, the old smallholder farms in central Italy were a thing of the old days, the good old days of the Republic, but not anymore. By the late 1st century, all the food is being produced on these massive plantations called latifundia. And on the latifundia, pretty much all the agricultural workers are slaves. From the person who swings the scythe or pulls the weeds, to the person who milks the goats, even to the person who keeps records for tax purposes. It was just easier to buy a person and then force them to do that job, rather than to go negotiate with another free person and say, hey, if I give you this many denarii per week, would you do task X, Y, and Z for me? Well, they just stopped doing that. It was not that labor was cheap, it was that human life was cheap. And so why pay a free person by the hour when you can find someone who is being trafficked, and then you can just purchase the right to kill them legally and keep them on your estate and force them to do whatever you want? Welcome to the ancient world. Welcome to the good old days. And now you can see why someone like John was not holding out a lot of hope for his civilization, or the idea that good people could prosper in a world like that. And like I said, I wanted to stress that slavery was not for unskilled labor. The slaves were not just the people who were driving the mule carts or shaking the fig trees so that the ripe fruit would drop. It was also the smart young guy who does the bookkeeping and manages the estate. That was the strange thing in the Roman world, was that you had people who did essentially paralegal work, who were legally not people. They were slaves. And so you can see that this is a world where it's not that everyone is being controlled by the elites and being controlled by being paid very little and then told to do a lot. They're actually just owned by the elites. It's a system of pure exploitation. They sort of cut out the middleman of contracts and payment and rights and negotiations like that. And I think the similarities between the Roman Empire and the United States was a similarity that people caught on to pretty early on. And I think that's why in the late 19th century we see that American Protestants began to have a particularly close relationship with the Book of Revelation. I remember when I was a kid, back in the days of what people are calling now the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 1990s, there was a definite sense that America had entered the end times, the tribulation, what John calls the thlipsis, the period of torture for the church. And there were definitely some cultural signposts and movements that they could point to make their point. They were not completely off base. And we will talk more about these specifically 20th century American interpretations of Revelation later on, especially when we encounter the being referred to as Toterion, in other words, the beast. So to take us back to where we left off, we ended at the end of chapter 8 with a very strange image of an eagle flying along the midline of the heavens, i.e. the ecliptic, crying out, "Uai, uai, uai," which is ancient Greek for the word woe. And John describes the eagle as expressing concern and trepidation for what will befall humans next in chapter 9. Now, using my recently acquired mediocre skills with Audacity, I used real eagle noises to imply that maybe John chose this image of an eagle crying because an eagle does make a sound that sounds like the ancient Greek word for woe. And so that seems to be a literary connection that was easy to make. I also chose to go with the eagle, not just because most of the manuscripts mention the eagle and not just the angel that the King James crew talked about. Another reason to go with the eagle would be a doctrine called Lectio Difficilior. So according to the doctrine of Lectio Difficilior, when you're examining copies of manuscripts, or if you are interpreting some sort of inscription, and you have a choice to make between two translations or two interpretations of what you're trying to read, you're supposed to pick the option that is more difficult. In other words, the one that seems less likely, the one that seems stranger. And that's counterintuitive, because you would think that you would go with what just seems like what they wanted to say. But this is supposed to be trying to counteract the tendency for copyists over time throughout the Middle Ages to mishear something that was read out and write what they would linguistically or culturally expect. Because remember, before the printing press in early modern Europe, you had rooms full of barely literate people who were hired as copyists, who would sit there in a room and listen to someone read a source text. And then all the copyists would write down what's being said. And hopefully, by the end of the day, you would have 20 copies of some document made. And that's how things worked in the ancient world. It wasn't exactly an information superhighway. That's why they called it the Iron Age and not the Information Age. And so I can see the logic behind someone in Elizabethan England who doesn't have this sort of native gut level familiarity with ancient Greek, and who also is not particularly familiar with the vocalizations of wild eagles. And so they chose to go with Angel, where the original author, who probably heard eagles crying in the wild all the time there on Patmos, and someone who is at least partly a native speaker of ancient Greek, it wouldn't be as strange of a literary choice for John as it would be for someone in the King James crew. So, a lot of people have been making a big deal about this beef between me and the King James crew. And I want everybody to remember that I did acknowledge their skill and mastery of the English language. I mean, they helped create modern English as we know it, and they actually made this quasi-French, quasi-German monstrosity that we call the English language take shape into something that, with a lot of talent, you can actually make sound decent. But let's face it, the King James crew was always really full of themselves. And if you've ever listened to any of their music, you'd know that. So, the King James Bible was published in 1611. 1611, and the King James crew became so famous after that they pretty much did nothing but hang out and party. And they got connected with the wrong people. They got into gambling. But they did meet some musicians. And this kind of fits because I've long been a big supporter of the very well-founded hypothesis that our instinct for music, our capacity to make and understand music, is a genetic human universal, and it's rooted in our ability to create language. In other words, I think music is an outgrowth of the neurological foundations of the first human language. And these variations of Homo erectus out there in Northeast Africa or Southwest Asia, we're not talking about astronomy or calculus or how to cut the best dovetail joint. They were expressing things like loneliness or lust or pain or fury or despair. And it turns out that music is really good at that. It's no surprise that someone who has some connection to language, some love or ability for languages, would also have some interest or capacity for music. And so it backs up my hypothesis that the King James crew went on to become prominent hip-hop artists of the London rap scene of the early 17th century AD. So, as I said, King James Bible published in 1611, and then the King James crew dropped their first single in 1618. And the title of the single was Kings of the Game. And Kings of the Game sold out. It was a smash hit. And here's the cool thing. So I looked it up. The copyright on a piece of music is 70 years after the death of the author, or the last of the authors. Because this dropped in 1618, the copyright ran out a long time ago. Now, I can play Kings of the Game in its entirety on the Conspiracy Farm right here for you guys, and I don't have to worry about a copyright strike. Now, talk about rare vinyl. Even as an aging Gen X Austin hipster, it was very hard to find this single. The records that they stamped back in the 1600s, not only did they not last long, but they don't have great noise reduction or fidelity. And so, fair warning, I did the best I could in terms of cleaning up the sound. But here we go. Here is the King James crew with their hit single, Kings of the Game. Let's hear.
Yeah, baby, you know we shine. King James, cool, we so fine. Conjugating verbs in line, showing off our style divine. Bending around the block so tight, wheels in hand, we ride all night. Talking loud, we stand and fight. King James power feels so right. We the kings of the game, ruling hard, we claim our name. Every verse brings more flame. King James crew, we stay the same.
It's where the powers that be, a den of thieves, one of a kind, and a sign of the times, the blind leading the blind, born again by the skin of my teeth. The spirit was willing, but my flesh was weak.
Yeah, you know we run the show. Every word we drop will grow. Through the highs and through the lows, our legacy continues to grow. Standing around the block so tight, quills in hand, we ride all night. Talking loud, we stand and fight. King James power feels so right. We the kings of the game, ruling hard, we claim our name. Every verse brings more flame. King James crew, we stay the same.
Now my cup runneth over, and I fight the good fight. I turn the world upside down like a thief in the night.
You're a drop in the bucket, the stumbling block. I be fruitful and multiply. You done fell by the wayside, fallen from grace, fell flat on your face in the twinkling of an eye. I'm the writing on the wall, and vengeance is mine.
Oh boy. Okay, well, that was interesting. If I were them, I would probably stick to translation and early modern English literature in general, if I were them. I mean, I know I have the privilege of hindsight here. I am able to go back and look and see the family tree of hip-hop and sort of see how the music developed over time, and I can see where the King James crew fits into that, I guess, with more perspective than they could have had. And that's only fair. You know, I say all that to say I'm basically getting a Boys to Men vibe here. I'm not sure how awesome that was. One cool thing I can say about the lyrics there is that, as you probably noticed, a few of those verses were created entirely out of phrases and idioms from the King James translation of the Bible that had become famous and became part of everyday modern English due to their skills in translation. So hearing those phrases coming back at you like that, they're asserting their literary dominance. It's just the kind of thing that you did on the hip-hop scene at the time. And you guys also don't have to deal with the cover art that came along with this old album. Okay, these gigantic collars were out of control. So, you know how you see a picture of Shakespeare or King James or whatever from this period, they've got the big ruffled collar, the big white lacy collar that they've packed full of starch, and it was supposed to stick out like the rays of the sun from their neck. It was really uncomfortable and strange, and everybody wore these things. And the richer you were, the bigger and fancier your collar was supposed to be. You're rough. RUFF. And so, let me tell you, on the hip-hop scene in the early 1600s, on the streets of London, the Elizabethan roughs got ridiculously big. And so, the King James crew, they'd do shows with collar ruffs that were literally 2 feet long. When they stood up straight, they couldn't even see past the collar. It was blocking their face. I mean, it's ridiculous. So, I'm supposed to take them seriously, even though one of them died being hit by an ox cart trying to cross the street in the middle of the night when they can't even see in front of their face because of the ruff.
Oh, my heavens! What a manly and glorious ruff this is indeed.
Indeed. Knowest thou what saith folk about the girth of a man's ruff betold?
An ox cart cometh.
Looketh out! An ox cart cometh!
And that's just silly. And I'm supposed to take them that seriously. And, okay, sure, they were handpicked by the Vicar of Christ on earth, i.e., the King of England, who, at the time, was the head of the Church of England, which was, as we all know, the only true religious faith ever known to mankind. And so, who am I, some colonial mutt, to question their authority? Okay, so where were we before we got sidetracked by the Dusty Collar crew? We were talking about the 3 trumpets left. 3 out of 7. Always the number 7 with John, as you recall. Today we're going to start with the 5th trumpet. And it's a doozy. Let's just say it's not something that happens every day. Not something that would be easy to describe. Not something you would expect. It's unexpected, in other words. Unexpected and unfortunate. But on a positive note, we do get to briefly meet an old acquaintance. In one episode of the J Word, we encountered a being called, let's see, what's his name? Satan. And he hasn't appeared in this book explicitly yet. His vibe is all over the place, though. We know he's there somewhere. And we don't really get a hero's entrance for Satan in the book, where he walks into frame and is referred to by name. And he's got a hype man next to him with a gigantic clock around his neck, rattling off all his titles and making sure that you show him respect. We don't get that. At the beginning of chapter 9, we get about as close as we are going to get to that. In other words, chapter 9 kicks off with the entrance of a being that is kind of hard to deny that this is probably Satan. But as usual with the book of Revelation, there's some differences of opinion and interpretation. So let's just jump right in and see what happens.
The 5th angel blew his trumpet. And I saw a star. Who had fallen down to the earth from the heavens. He was given the key that opened the shaft that leads to the abyss. He unlocked the shaft over the bottomless pit. And smoke rose up out of the deep, like smoke from a huge furnace. The sun and the air grew dark from the smoke from the pit.
Oh boy. Well, this passage is particularly famous because it brings up so many issues, and it's very strange. One thing that jumps out at you immediately is this kind of bait and switch that John pulls here, where he talks about a star, but then he makes it clear that this star is some sort of person or being. Of course, since this is a star that fell from the heavens and is unleashing evil on the earth, then it has been associated with Satan. And in a previous episode, we did talk about how, according to mainstream Christian theology, Satan has a great deal of authority over the earth. And in an Orthodox Christian view, this authority has been granted by God because it would have to be in order for it to occur in the universe. In mainstream Christian theology, everything in the universe occurs only due to two things. One is through God's action to further His will, and then the second is through God's deliberate inaction in deference to our free will. And so, technically, those are the only two ways anything can happen. And so you could say, well, what if this is a loyal angel sent by God down to unlock the pit? Or it could just be another disloyal angel, hence a demon, who is allowed to unlock the pit. Or this could be Satan himself, playing a major role in these final days before he himself is confined beneath the earth. Or this could be a loyal angel, an archangel, who is at the moment remaining nameless. And so whoever this being is, by being given this key to unlock this shaft that leads under the earth, is a major authority. As we'll see, it's going to have a lot of downstream effects, as we'll say. And so the word for star they're using is astera, which is the basic Greek word for star. So the translation is very straightforward. And then it's a simple key, a piece of metal that unlocks a lock that was given to this being. Now this shaft that they're unlocking, the shaft that leads to a bottomless pit, the Greek word that's being used there is translated elsewhere as a well, as in a very deep, relatively narrow tunnel straight down to the center of the earth, and then maybe even beyond that. Now, the scale of everything has been amplified in these images, and so I'm thinking this is a narrow, straight tunnel relative to the size of the ocean. And so now we can imagine a bottomless well miles in diameter. Now you've probably noticed that I'm trying to cover some of the meaning by translating the word abyss also as bottomless pit. And that's essentially what it means. The term byssos, which we would transliterate B-Y-S-S-O-S, which is the part of the abyss without the A, just byssos instead of abyssos. Byssos means the depth of, or the bottom of. And so if something is abyssos, it means that it has no bottom. There is no depth to measure. And so we're talking about something that could be translated as a bottomless pit or the endless deep. So we're talking about a shaft of infinite depth, a shaft that has no end. The phrase endless deep is also used a lot in translations, and I think that has the kind of nightmarish, infinite sinking feeling combined with a poetic verbal simplicity that was intended. And as I said before, this Greek word abyssos literally just means without a bottom, profound, very, very deep. Now, this is connected to the Hebrew word tehom, which is used in the Old Testament, in Genesis in particular, to refer either to the ocean or to the underworld. So it's generally just places below the earth. unseen places at the bottom of the ocean or under the surface of the earth. Or, I think, what is implied in the passages we just heard, both. Something that is under the ocean floor. For example, in the Old Testament, there are times when it's describing the underworld in the sense of the place where the spirits of the dead dwell or where wicked souls are confined. They refer to the bottomless pit, to Tehom, to the endless deep. Also, before creation was completed, in Genesis, it talks about the earth being without form and void. And then there's that statement, darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, in Hebrew, when it says upon the face of the deep, it's using tehom there. So it's referring to the place that we're talking about here. So this deep that was without form and void before the earth was created is the place that's being opened up now. And it's a place where we know some dark things have been confined. Now, if you do what I try to do and just let these words paint a picture in your head, I think most people will picture something that seems like a volcanic event of some kind. And I think that's what is intended here. I think John saw something that involves volcanic activity. Now, note that volcanic activity occurs as a result of an asteroid impact. And so you can see that there's a broad range of things that might be happening here that would explain what John is seeing. And now thinking back to the fact that this is a star that's being personified and associated with Satan, in other words, is that just poetic license? In other words, what if John is really saying that he saw something that looked like a star fall out of the sky? And then it appears to open a hole in the earth that belches out so much smoke. And note that what looks like smoke is what a modern geologist would call a pyroclastic flow. In other words, a cloud of superheated ash that can billow up out of volcanoes that are erupting. This is exactly what Pompeii was buried in. And John would have known a lot about this. Pompeii was destroyed in 79 AD. And John would have been a teenager or a young man at the time. And news traveled lightning fast around the Mediterranean. And John was a well-traveled, urban, literate person by the standards of the time. So it's extremely unlikely that he would have been in the dark about the danger of volcanoes. In fact, based on the timing of the destruction of Pompeii, 9 years after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, it makes you wonder whether John would have interpreted the destruction of Pompeii as a kind of natural consequence of what the pagans were doing to Christians at the time. Makes you wonder. What John is describing here is far worse than the eruption of just one volcano in Italy. Mountains are generally not described as bottomless pits. So this is a hole in the earth, not a volcano, because John knew what those were. He would have just said, "Hey, I saw a volcano erupting with fire and ash." But no, he sees this bright object drop out of the sky, and then the next thing he sees is, quote-unquote, smoke pouring out of a bottomless pit. That's more like what an asteroid strike would look like. An asteroid strike that's about the size of the Chicxulub impact event would create a global scale pyroclastic flow. So imagine the entire west coast of North and South America and the Pacific Rim cities all leveled by pyroclastic flows. In other words, these billowing, rolling, giant clouds of superheated ash that ignite anything flammable that they touch. An impact in the Pacific Ocean could bury half the continent in burning ash, and there would be earthquakes that would send us back to the Stone Age. Imagine an hour-long earthquake at level 10 on the Richter scale. So we're talking earthquakes where they're so severe that even if you're outside a building on flat ground and you're nowhere near anything that could fall on you, you could still be injured strictly from the G-forces of the earth moving under your feet. That's pretty intense. And so before we move on, just bear in mind that ever since the book was published, both Christian and secular scholars have seen Revelation as being layered and cyclical. In other words, there are multiple references to the same event, and the same event will be seen in different contexts. So, this impact may be related to the impact we talked about in previous episodes. This may not be an entirely separate event. As you might recall, this is not the first object we've seen falling out of the sky and having a very negative effect on the Earth. And so, once again, we might be seeing a diffraction here. His vision may be a kind of house of mirrors type of image where he's seeing different aspects of the same events at the same time in a way that seems simultaneous. I guess that's a long way to say the book of Revelation is not linear storytelling. You have to sort of think of John as writing in the same style as Christopher Nolan. He has a tendency to have a loose or creative relationship with time when it comes to storytelling. But we are moving on to describe more of the consequences of this pyroclastic flow, this cloud of smoke that billows up out of this giant hole in the earth. So what happens next? We've got all this smoke. Does the smoke just blow away and everybody's okay? A little scared, a little shaken up, but none the worse? No such luck. Let's see what happens.
And out of this smoke, locusts fell down onto the earth. And they had the same powers as scorpions do. They were told not to harm the grass, or any green thing, or any tree. And they could not harm people who had the seal of God on their foreheads. They were not allowed to kill anyone, only torture them for 5 months. And this torment was like the pain of a scorpion sting. And in those days, people will look for death, but they won't find it. They will want to die, but death will run from them.
Okay, well, this is an unexpected development. One thing I can assure you is that the translation is about as plain as it gets. The word for smoke here is the Greek word for smoke. The word for locust, akrides, is the Greek word for a locust, and nothing else. When he says that they have the same powers as scorpions, he uses the word skorpioi. Skorpios in Greek would be a scorpion. It's where we get the word from. And so He's using very ordinary words for ordinary things, but it's clear that they are stand-ins for something else. Also note that when they were told not to harm the grass or any green thing, the phrase used is ude pan chloron, meaning nothing that was chloros, or green, as we talked about earlier. And once again, we have to talk about John sort of just knowing the intent or the sphere of authority of the figures that he's seeing in the vision. So in this case, he knows that these locusts had a mission and instructions. They had rules of engagement, in other words. So they were not supposed to destroy anything green, any living plants, or any of the small group of people who had the seal of God on their foreheads. And they had the authority, or they were allowed to torture people for 5 months. And it's interesting, this authority in Greek is exousia, which is really like the powers that a superhero has, or the executive authority of a president. So it really does refer to what someone has the legal or physical capability to do. Now, at the very end there, in the Greek, it says that the people will search for death, and in Greek, death is thanatos. So they were looking for ton thanaton, but me heuresusin auton. They were not able to find it. They could not find it. Now, believe it or not, you've heard that word heuresusin before. You've heard it in another form, heureka. Me heuresusin means they will not find it. But heureka means I have found it. Heureka, probably in the Doric form heuraka, was famously spoken by an ancient Greek speaker named Archimedes. Archimedes. Now, Archimedes was a famous mathematician and early engineer who lived in Syracuse in Sicily. And Syracuse was ruled by a Greek tyrant who was fantastically wealthy. And Archimedes lived there and was hired by the tyrant to basically develop siege defenses and other cool mechanical stuff that made Syracuse famous at the time. A lot of people may have heard of the Antikythera mechanism. Oh boy, Antikythera. And it's basically this fantastically complex clock-like machine that, when it was found in a shipwreck, it was highly doubted to have been from this time period because it was considered to be way too advanced in terms of the metallurgy and the tolerances of the cuts in the gears and that sort of thing. Well, it turns out that it appears that ancient people were capable of those kinds of feats of engineering on occasion on a very small scale. And it turns out that there are accounts of devices that Archimedes built. And apparently someone could actually travel to Syracuse to see planetaria, these mechanical representations of the stars and the planets in motion that Archimedes built or designed and had built with the funding of the local tyrant. And the story behind Eureka and why Archimedes ran down the street yelling that does give you a good picture of what kind of person Archimedes was. I think it's fair to say there's good evidence that Archimedes was on the autism spectrum. And there are a lot of stories about his unusual way of relating to people. but then also his extremely creative, if obsessive, work methods. Archimedes was known for forgetting to eat or sleep or bathe while he was working on a problem, either a mathematical proof or designing some device. And so Archimedes was working on a method for determining whether material was made of real gold all the way through or whether it was just gold-plated. Now, he wanted to be able to do this quickly and efficiently without having to cut open the material or damage it in any way. And of course, as some of you with physics or chemistry backgrounds know, Archimedes started to look at the idea of specific gravity. And so he could dunk an object in water and look at the mass of the water that was displaced by the object, and with some math, he could figure out what it was made of. He could figure out whether he was looking at something that was solid gold. And so, thanks to this water displacement idea, Archimedes was so excited that he had a method now that he could prove what a substance was made of. He was so excited that apparently, without dressing himself appropriately, he burst out the door of his well-to-do home and ran down the street saying, "Heureka!" or in his probable dialect, "Heureka! I've found it! I have found it!" And that's the story. Now, is that true? There are a lot of these little legends about Archimedes, and I personally think that, where there's smoke, there's fire. It doesn't seem like a stretch to me that he would be an unusual person, given his unusual achievements. And this is in the late 200s BC. So this is after the Roman Republic formed, but before the imperial system was in place. This is before Caesar. However, it was after Alexander the Great. And so when the Roman general Marcellus laid siege to Syracuse in 212 BC, his goal was to secure a very important, wealthy, prominent Greek-speaking city and bring it into the Roman sphere. Now, obviously, even though Archimedes' devices had caused a lot of trouble for the Roman invaders, when they broke into the city, the Roman general Marcellus gave his soldiers strict instructions to find Archimedes and not to harm him. However, according to the popular traditions that disseminated after the fall of Syracuse, a Roman soldier broke into Archimedes' house, where he was, of course, working very diligently on some sort of mathematical or engineering problem. And the way he would work was he would have a table of fine sand that he would draw figures in to do his mathematical proofs or to work on his geometric thinking, or to sketch out the early plans for the designs for new devices. And apparently, when the soldier broke in, the only thing Archimedes could focus on was to make sure that that sand was not disturbed, that his work wasn't erased. And the Roman soldier ordered him to get up and come out of the house and follow him. Archimedes refused and protested about the disturbance, and the Roman soldier, in a fit of rage, killed Archimedes. Now, we do have an account that Marcellus was infuriated by this, but we don't know that the soldier was disciplined or punished for this. Apparently, that's the story. So, the Greco-Roman world lost a great mathematical and engineering mind to the senseless violence of Rome as it was attempting to wrest power from its neighbors in the Western Mediterranean in the late 200s BC. And so we hear about a story of the last words of Archimedes were, "Don't disturb my circles." Well, we don't know if that's exactly what he said. There appears to have been some sort of misunderstanding that led to his death during the end of the siege of Syracuse. Well, I think that's a good stopping point for today. In the next volume, we'll jump back into the Revelation to hear more from John about these locust things. I think we can already tell they're far more dangerous than a normal swarm of locusts. In Volume 7, it will quickly become very clear that these are not actually locusts. They're what I've come to call the locust armored horse torture copter things. And in Volume 7, we'll hear a lot more about these locust armored horse torture copter things and the various weapons that they will use against humans. And speaking of humans, we'll also find out more about what the survivors are doing during all this. How are the humans responding to all this suffering and unexpected and unfortunate stuff? I think we all can't help but consider a little bit what we would do in this kind of situation. We know that some people will rise to the occasion and show their greatness, and they will help out their fellow man in this darkest of times, in this time of deepest need, when we really need to all pull together and help each other out. But then there's people who will fall into the deepest despair and fall into the darkest of Machiavellian dark triad calculations. And they would become the most aggressive, paranoid, arrogant, ruthless people on Earth. And I put myself in that category. I definitely would not rise to the occasion and show my greatness and help out my fellow man. The time for helping each other out was before the book started, before the abyss opened up. Now that it has opened, all this friendly civilization stuff goes out the window. I'm going to be looking for weapons, water, shelter, food, all the basic stuff. My attitude wouldn't be great. Especially if I figured out that the events from John's vision were actually happening now in real life. I would know that there's nothing that can be done to avoid it, so I would just kind of, to paraphrase Metallica, I would just ride the lightning, see how long I could hold out. I'd be curious to see if I could make it to the very, very end. Because in the end, maybe curiosity is my primary emotion, the one that rules over everything else. My curiosity has certainly gotten the best of me at times. It's gotten me into a lot of trouble. But I think to some extent that's just part of being human. I think we're all curious about how the world will end. I think most of us don't want to be there to see it in detail. That's where I'm weird. But, speaking of the end of the world, in our next volume, Volume 7, we'll wrap up this very strange Chapter 9 with its torture monsters. And in Volume 8, we will move on to Chapter 10. And unfortunately, it only gets worse and more confusing. My hard drive is starting to get full of very horrific sound clips. I don't just type the sounds that I want into an AI and it just creates it for me. I have to go out and make this stuff myself out of little pieces of sounds that I find here and there. And so unfortunately, I am busily preparing even more gut-wrenching sound effects for the later chapters. What I've found is that you have to use real screams and real pain noises. Movie screams or screams by people trying to record a scream sound in a sterile sound booth doesn't work. It's got to be real. So I'd like everyone to please note that whenever I'm not writing rap lyrics, or whenever I'm not working with the AI to make beats, and whenever I'm not translating Greek, I also have to take time to listen to lots of people groaning and gasping and screaming over and over and over again to get the sounds right. So when I sit down to record my comments on this stuff, and I have a weird detached attitude toward what's going on in the book, well, it's because I've had to deal with all of the ugliness well before I sat down to talk to you about it. And so for upcoming chapters, just know that I had to find noises that are even worse, more upsetting. So be ready. Remember the trigger warning in the trailer. I kind of put that in there half seriously. And speaking of being serious, and not making a joke of things that you shouldn't joke about, remember, the next time you have a drink, or a beer, or a 40, pour out a couple of sips for our fallen homies from the King James crew. I talked smack about them. I threw shade on their roughs. But I do take them seriously. They are the giants whose shoulders people like me stand on. And damn it, if they like wearing gigantic ruffs,
Oh my heavens.
then who am I to judge? Who are any of us to judge them? You know? It's just not really funny to me at all. I mean, I'm not laughing. This is very serious stuff. End of the world stuff and all. It's a time when people will seek death, but then they can't find it. Well, I hope that, as of right now, we're all seeking life wherever we can find it, and not death. And if you're seeking something good, I hope you find what you're looking for. But remember that when you do discover that thing you've been seeking and working so long and hard for, you have to remember to take off all your clothes and then run out the front door naked, racing down the street in front of all your neighbors, yelling, Heureka! Heureka! Do it to honor Archimedes. That was very wrong what happened to him, and we need to remember him. And all the quiet, unsung geniuses like him. Talk to you later.